Hello and welcome to the Advanced Placement World History Podcast. This is the final episode of the AP World History Podcast, so if you made it this far, congratulations. We're going to conclude the AP course by looking at the concept of globalization. In the 20th century and into the 21st century, the world's economy and culture is becoming more and more connected, intertwined, codependent, whatever you want to call it. Basically, every day the world's becoming smaller and smaller, and this is essentially what globalization means. But this process of the world becoming more and more connected isn't something new, and we have the long view of world history behind us in this course. We know that it has its roots in much older processes of world history. So going way back to the exchanges along the Silk Road and the Indian Ocean and across the Sahara Desert, we looked at the spread of Buddhism, the spread of Christianity, and the spread of Islam. And up until 1500, these networks of exchange carried religions and diseases, technologies, ideas all over Eurasia and Africa. And then in 1492, something major happens in world history. We have the linking of the Eastern and Western hemispheres through the Columbian Exchange. The Columbian Exchange incorporates America and Inner Africa as well into a more global network of communication and exchange, but also a network of exploitation. And with the Columbian Exchange, we have exploitation on a much more global scale than ever before, whole regions of the world taking advantage of whole other regions of the world. And then in the 1800s, we have the Industrial Revolution, and with it a new round of European empires in Asia and Africa. So all of this is the foundation for globalization in the 20th century. And by the 20th century, it means that world events are occurring on a more global scale than ever before. The major events of the 20th century impacted the world as a whole, not specific regions of the world. So for example, the world wars were fought all over the world. Empires would call in their colonies to help them fight the wars. The Great Depression impacted the whole world because the economy was more global than it had ever been before. So in the developing world, if a poor nation's economy is based on exporting rubber to wealthier nations, for example, and now the wealthier nations can't afford to buy rubber anymore, the economic crisis, the Great Depression, passes on to the poorer nation. So a more connected economy meant a move away from subsistence farming, growing food to feed oneself or the community, and a move to growing things for export. And this export-based economy in the developing world made the Great Depression a global event. We have communism spreading around the globe, and the Cold War is fought between capitalism and communism in Korea, in Vietnam, in Afghanistan, almost in Cuba. So this podcast will try to give an overview of the impact of globalization in the 20th century by looking at four major processes of the 20th century. The first section of the podcast will focus on the world economy. The second section of the podcast will focus on the rise of feminism or global feminism. The third section of the podcast will focus on the conflict between modernization and globalization and how that conflicts with major world religions. And the final section will focus on the emerging environmental movement. Since the emergence of settled agricultural communities about 10,000 years ago, the world has slowly been coming together and becoming more and more connected. There have been times when this process has reversed and connections have dried up and the world has become more disconnected. A good example of this is Western Europe during the classical and post-classical periods. The Roman and Han empires created a huge network of exchange throughout Eurasia. When the Roman Empire collapsed, these networks of exchange contracted or dried up, along with the collapse of the Han Empire. People living in Western Europe became much less connected to the larger Eurasian economy. And this was a very hard time in Europe. It's called medieval times or the Dark Ages. A more modern example would be during the Great Depression, which really destroyed the global economy. There was less international trade, less investment, and instead states tended to place high taxes on global trade and really withdrew within themselves, tried to isolate themselves from the global economy. So those are two examples of world trade, global connections becoming less connected or drying up a little bit. But the general process throughout world history that we've looked at is the world has become more and more and more connected over time. So after World War II, the economy gets back on track after the Great Depression, and this process of globalization resumes. One thing that made this possible were two new global institutions that were set up to regulate the world economy to make sure that something like the Great Depression would never happen again. These are the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund, or the IMF. So, near the end of World War II, we have global institutions set up to regulate the world economy, something that we didn't have so much before. There are also new technologies that made transporting goods all around the world easier. An example of a new technology would be huge oil tankers that made shipping goods around the world much cheaper than any other point in human history. We also have in the United States in particular, but also in Great Britain, France, Canada, a new economic and political ideology called neoliberalism. And the central idea of neoliberalism is that there should be free trade between countries, fewer government taxes, and less regulation on trade. But the one factor that probably sped up this process of globalization the most was the emergence of massive global businesses known as transnational corporations. These transnational corporations make things all over the world and sell them all over the world. And the reason this happens is because companies are able to move around the world looking for the cheapest places to make stuff, or for the places that have the lowest level of environmental regulations. So take Nike, for example. Over a 5-year period, Nike closed 20 factories in the developing world and opened 35 more. By the year 2000, 51 of the world's 100 largest economies were transnational corporations, not countries. So, what impact does globalization have on the world's diverse peoples and diverse regions? Well, for one, globalization created the greatest economic growth in world history. Today, we are producing far more than any other point in human history. Controlled for inflation, world output per capita was $2,835 in 1959. Today, that number is $8,753. So that's $8,753 per person. That's 3.5 times more stuff being produced now than in 1950. On top of that, life expectancies grew everywhere, infant mortality dropped, literacy increased, global poverty on average is actually falling. So we are producing more, not just more stuff, but more stuff per capita. And on average, people are better off today than they were, say, 100 years ago. The controversy lies in how all this new wealth is being distributed around the world. In the 19th century, we have the Industrial Revolution, and the Industrial Revolution really creates this new division in the world: rich industrialized countries of Europe and North America, and everyone else. In 1820, the richest 20% of the world was 3 times richer than the poorest 20%. By 1991, the richest 20% of the world are 86 times richer than the bottom 20%. So, from the earliest civilizations, there's always been this gap between the rich and poor. But globalization hasn't done anything to bridge this gap, and actually seems to be making it worse. Despite the fact that we're producing far more wealth than at any other time in history, there are still many people who don't have access to basic necessities like medical care or clean drinking water or education. And it's this conflict between rich and poor that's really driving a new kind of global conflict, the conflict between developing and developed nations. For the past 50 years, or since gaining independence, developing nations have been really trying hard to reform the global economy and to make it more favorable for them, but there are a number of obstacles to reform. The first obstacle is that developed nations, rich nations, are resistant to change. By and large, developed nations are democracies. They're voted into power by the people they govern. And the trend over the past 50 years, anyways, is that people have tended to vote for a system that will benefit themselves more as individuals, as opposed to voting for a fairer international economy or voting for social justice. The attitude is still very much, what is this person voting for, or what is this person that I'm voting for going to do for me, as opposed to, how is this person I'm voting for going to make the world a better place. So developed nations can be resistant to change. A second obstacle to reforming the world economy is that it's hard for countries in the developing world to find common ground with each other. So take a country in the Middle East that's getting rich from oil. It doesn't have a lot in common with a country in Central America whose main export is bananas. Countries like China and India that are rapidly developing and industrializing have very different concerns than the poorest countries in Africa. So each country in the developing world has their own goals and ambitions, and presenting them as a united front has been a challenge. So to sum up what I've just said, globalization has created a lot of wealth, but this wealth is distributed unevenly to the world's peoples and has widened the gap between rich and poor. And we'll just take this concept a bit further. Globalization hasn't just widened the gap between rich and poor countries, it has widened the gap between rich and poor people living in the same country. And this goes for both poor countries and rich countries, or developing nations and developed nations. So, take the United States, for example. It's typically viewed as the richest country in the world. Today, people in the United States are losing jobs overseas. And quite simply, this is because a factory worker in the United States makes 30 times more than a factory worker in China. So, in the age of globalization and transnational corporations, why would that factory stay open in the United States? So we have this mass shift of manufacturing jobs to Asia and Latin America, and Americans find that they're out of jobs. So the transnational corporation is becoming richer, a lot of the people are becoming poorer. And this basic formula of shipping work overseas doesn't apply to only low-skilled factory jobs. A lot of highly skilled work is being outsourced. So take computer programming, for example. Why pay a computer programmer $90,000 a year in Canada when you can hire somebody in India with a master's degree or a PhD to do the same job for $10,000 or $15,000 a year? So, although globalization has produced wealth, it's also produced a lot of hardships and inequality, and these hardships have fueled a popular movement aimed at counteracting globalization. It's broadly known as the Anti-globalization movement. The central belief, or central beliefs of the anti-globalization movement is that free trade and market-driven corporate globalization is lowering labor standards, is contributing to environmental damage, is preventing poorer countries from protecting themselves from abuse, is ignoring local cultures and human rights, and is deepening global inequality while mainly serving the interests of the rich. So these are some of the issues we're going to look at in the next sections of the podcast. The anti-globalization movement has had protests all over the world over the last 20 years or so. One of the most famous ones was in 1999 in Seattle during a meeting of the World Trade Organization, and there's a short clip from that in the AP World History Television section of the course. You can take a look at that.